You're listening to the Homeownership podcast by Momentum Realty, real estate talk for buying, selling, and owning property.
Hey guys, Sean Patrick Maloney here, broker owner of Momentum Realty, located in Hanover, Massachusetts. Welcome to episode 58, Planting Trees and Shrubs. I'm your host, Sean Patrick Maloney. Thanks for joining me this week. I want to talk to you about planting trees and shrubs. We always talk about curb appeal in real estate. We always talk about different things you can do to spruce up the place. This is good for you homeowners out there as well as you sellers that are looking to get your property ready to go up for sale. So one of the first things we want to talk about is where to buy the trees and shrubs. I know a lot of people love to run down to the hardware store, look for discount plants and buy them. Well, some places are okay because they have a 1-year warranty on the plant. Most of the time they don't tell you the nursery stock is in very poor condition. So you just want to look at nursery stock and say, well, what am I looking for? Now, most people might not know exactly what you're looking for. You might want to grab a book out and just take a quick peek. But what you're looking for is originally, if it's a tree, you're looking for a good center column as far as the actual original trunk that it goes up all the way to the top and doesn't branch out to a whole bunch of branches. With shrubs, you're just looking for overall balance in the fact that they weren't kept in an environment before the hardware store got them where they were trimmed constantly to be skinny and be in rows so that they could maximize the amount of inventory in the least amount of space. I recommend going to places like that Blooming Place over in Pembroke or other places like that pay attention to the quality of the nursery stock that they buy. They have the room, they have the outdoor space, and they have the knowledge of what is good tree stock, what is good shrub stock, and how do we keep it that way. So I think that's a really important one to think is not all plants are created equally. The other one to remember when you're going there, and this is going to be in what to buy as well, is just keep in mind that the word arborvitae or the word hydrangea or the word azalea, they're not one plant. There's a million different types of every plant, and buying the right one is going to make all the difference. Let's next talk about transport. I all the time see people driving a plant home from the nursery with the windows down, or they have the plant out in the open. As always, plants don't normally drive down the road. They don't travel, they're stuck to the ground. So you basically are putting them in hurricane conditions when you're traveling home. And there is a thing called desiccation, which is just like how us humans sweat. They actually lose moisture through their leaves through desiccation. What can happen is you can do a wind burn to the plant. So you've actually dried all the leaves out so quickly because of the air passing by them that you actually kill the plant, or at least you defoliate it. If you defoliate a tree and you plant it at the same time, you're talking 2 times of damage at the same time. Because when we plant a tree, we got to remember we're damaging the tree at that time. The trees do have resources such as starch buildups that they can reach into, but if you make them reach into that twice in a row, what you're going to find is the plant's going to be on its heels already, and it's probably going to die when we plant it. So when we're transporting them, we want to make sure we cover the foliage. We want to make sure we travel slowly. We want to make sure that the foliage is pointed in the right direction, that it's not just into the wind. When you put a tree or a shrub in, you want to put the root ball side facing the direction of travel so that the wind is going up and through the leaves versus the other direction around where it's going to be blowing down into them and bending all the branches. So now let's talk about what to buy. Well, one of the things you want to do is find out exactly where you're going. What's the sun like? What's the weather like in that condition of that part of the property? If it's over by the heater and there's an exhaust vent, maybe you can get away with having a warmer weather plant that during the wintertime might get a little bit of heat from the fact that you're getting heat from the heating system of the home. Whereas if you're putting it out on the waterfront, it's going to sit there in the wind and all that during the wintertime, you might want to buy something a little more hardy, as they call them. So you want to know the zone map. You want to know which plants you have for your localized area, because here in Massachusetts, we actually have more than 3 different zones within this one state, because you're going to have different zones from out on the tip of the Cape all the way over to Western Mass, because obviously we have a lot of different weather conditions. Another thing you also want to think about is how much snow you get and what plants deal best with that snow. So that's something you got to think about your personal location and take a look at. On every plant, there's going to be a little ID tag that's going to tell you what zone and what it can deal with. So you definitely want to make sure you take advantage of looking at that tag and make sure you make the right choices. Some other choices you want to think about is what type of soil do you have? How much water do you want to give the plant? And if you're not going to be irrigating, chances are you probably can't have the prettiest of the plants. Most of the prettiest of the plants need more water. Lots of ones that have tons and tons of flowers, well, creating all those flowers takes a lot of water and it also takes a lot of nutrients. So you want to think about that. You might have to go more towards evergreens if you're going to have a really dry place because they're able to deal with it more. Maybe the seagrasses will work for those types of locations as well, and other plants that grow in these conditions that are not exactly optimal for other things. And before I said, sun is a huge one. But you also got to remember, if you're planting trees and you have a whole bunch of sun plants there already, when that tree grows, is it going to kill all your existing plants? Now you may notice as I continue to go on, it's a really complicated thing. Well, this is a living environment. People think of plants as just things like paints and curtains that you just choose colors and different sizes and shapes that you like, but the reality is you're dealing with something that's living and breathing, just like your pet, just like you as a human. You got to think about the fact that, number one, they might be cute and fuzzy when they're small, but they grow up. When you plant a tree with your kids that they bring home from the school system that's just a little sprig, yeah, eventually that someday is going to be a 75-foot tall pine tree or something else like that. So you want to think of that location. Are you planting it close enough to the house, or are you planting it too close to the house? Because as it reaches out with its branches 15 or 20 feet, you may have wished you put it out in a bed in the center of the yard so that it's reaching up and over the home and not reaching into the side of the home because you planted it in the foundation planting. So make sure you make the right choice for the location you have. Then when it comes to proper planting, you want to think about a lot of things. The number one thing is that the guy who wrote that tag or the woman who wrote the tag, they didn't just decide to write some instructions in there to make you do a lot of work. Like when they say that the hole should only be as deep as the root ball, but it should be 1.5 times as wide as the root ball. When you say this, a lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm just going to dig it and stuff it in. The reality is the ground around it's going to be like concrete. So by breaking that ground up, we're going to allow for a couple things. Number one, we're going to allow for air penetration. Number two, we're going to allow for water penetration to get down to the root systems. And number three, those roots that were just damaged during the planting process are able to then take and grow into this new soil. So when we're doing it, we're going to buy some bag soil. We're also going to buy some soil amendments, some things like fertilizer to put down in the hole with the plant on the original installation. So that way there, as the plant gets growing, it has everything it needs to survive at the beginning. We're also going to water inside the hole before we fill it in, because one of the things a lot of people get confused by, and I remember when I first got it started in plant sciences, I didn't really understand when you water the ground, you might put down 10 gallons in, say, 1 minute. But the reality is soil layers only saturate horizontally and not vertically. Until one layer of soil is saturated, it won't drip down to the next layer. So if you put water on quickly, what this means is it's going to move to the side versus getting down to the roots. So that first time when we're putting in, we can water the plant heavily before we install it. We can water the soil around the edges of it, and we can water in the hole to make sure that it has a great start for that beginning week where it's just under a lot of stress from the move and it's going to have some issues. Another thing that's really important to pay attention to is something called root flare. If you go out in the woods, anywhere that people have never been, you're going to notice that every single tree almost looks like it's walking on the earth. It has this place where the trunk ends and the roots reach out and they're almost above ground, whereas when you look at anything people are planting, it almost looks like a telephone pole. Well, the reality is a lot of people think when it grows, it's going to lift up. I hate to break it to you, but no tree ever lifts up. It's exactly where you left it. It's just bigger as time goes on. And the root flare actually plays an enormous role in the plant's life. Number one role that it plays is during the process of photosynthesis and the process of turning carbon dioxide into oxygen is that it's got to breathe out. It's got to exhale somewhere. The exhalation is done down on the root flare. So that's an important one, and it can toxify the tree if it can't breathe out. And you'll commonly see this in parking lots like Lowe's and other places where you'll see these bleeding, oozing wounds in the midpoint of the tree. And what that is the gases breaking through the trunk to get out of there. So that's a big one. The other one you're going to notice is whenever you see these totem pole or telephone pole trees, go over there, no matter how long they're in the ground, shake them, and you'll notice you'll be able to move them. One of the things that happens is the plant's roots get confused because as soon as you put soil on the trunk and the root flare is buried, the roots think that they're farther away from the trunk than they are, and they go into what's called secondary root zones. So similar to how we as humans have main arteries all the way down to capillaries, they also have primary versus secondary root zones. So by burying this, we're going to confuse the root zones. It's similar to if your heart suddenly started growing a whole bunch of capillaries around it. It wraps the most important part, the pump, which down at the bottom of the tree is the pump that's moving all that water and all that food up and down and feeding the whole entire tree. So the roots end up choking the plant off, and you end up with what they call girdling roots or encircling roots that choke into the others. And as they cut into them, they cut those main feeder lines by accident. As trees continue to expand and not move, they cut each other off and you end up with real big trouble. So we want to make sure we do that. And another thing we want to think about is when we're planting a plant, if it's been inside a pot for a long time, you may have heard the term root bound. A lot of times you pull it out of the pot and it still looks like it's in a pot. All the roots are going in a circle. Now you want to take and you want to choose some and cut some of them, and you want to point them in the outward facing direction. And then with your hand you want to loosen any that you can and have them pointed in that outward facing direction, because what that's going to do, it's going to allow the plant to know now I'm no longer in this pot and I can reach out away from the root zone that I'm in and I can take advantage of this new land. That's a really important one. Don't beat the heck out of the plant. I would say, depending on the size, anywhere from 4 to 8 cuts throughout and reaching them out. If you can pay attention to ones and unwrap as many as you can and be patient with it, that's going to help out a great deal, because the more of the roots we can save, the better. If you buy a plant that's overly root bound, return it before you even bother starting, because if it's severely root bound and you cut a bunch, you're going to end up with a troublesome plant that's going to grow for a while and eventually it's going to fade out and you're not going to understand why. So make sure you check that out as well. Another thing to think about is cabling. After planting a tree, if it's fairly decent size or we're coming into the winter, you're going to worry about it tipping over. A lot of people think you can just wrap a cable around the tree and down to the ground and make that happen. While this can be done for a temporary period, you got to remember that a tree expands out. And if you're there with a rope or cable wrapped around it, you're eventually going to choke off the tree. The other thing that's going to happen if you don't protect the tree is it's going to rub it and it's going to cut holes in the bark. The bark works just like your skin. You have to think, if you get a whole bunch of rubbing on your skin, you're eventually going to end up with blisters, and then if you don't take care of those, you're going to end up with an infection. So you want to pay attention to how you wrap it, and you also want to have protective coatings. The sooner you can get those cables off the tree, the better. So a lot of people leave them on for a really long period of time. You really don't need them on most trees. Most trees are perfectly fine within a few weeks to actually take on the whole process of growing themselves. Let's talk one other thing real quick, and I just want to give you a little more info here, is when to plant. This year has been an exceptionally great year to plant plants. We have a very warm winter, and we have a lot of time. What I always say is the sooner you get that plant in the ground, the better. They always say in old times, the best time to plant a tree is yesterday. What they mean by that is when you're coming into summer, you want to give that plant as much time as possible to grow before it goes into the heat of the summer. You certainly don't want to be planting a bunch of expensive plants on July 4th because you want to have the house looking nice. You really want to have them planted in the months of September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, and sometimes May, depending on how the year goes. December can be tough because the ground can be frozen, but lots of plants can be planted in the dead of the winter. The best time is when you have an early spring like we have now and you can get it in the ground, because that plant has a long time in the cool, wet environment, and when you water the plant, it's not going to evaporate so quickly, so it's going to get a really good time to start. It's also never going to get scalded by the quick heat and not having enough water in its leaf system. So if you can get a plant in an early spring, it's going to be a real big advantage to you. I hope this helps you overall in choosing when and how to plant trees and shrubs throughout your yard. In a future episode, I'll make sure to do species of New England and talk a little further about what you can choose. But if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out to us directly. And if you want more help on how to choose good curb appeal, feel free to reach out to one of our Move mentors. They'd love to help you in making decisions, and they have access to me, who has the knowledge from my previous plant businesses. Thank you for listening this week, and I look forward to talking to you next week.